I was 24 in the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a solo trip through Austria. I had always liked hiking, and camping felt like the best way to disconnect for a while. I flew into Vienna, spent a few days in the city, and then took a train out to the countryside. My plan was simple: hike through the forest trails, camp in different spots, and enjoy the quiet. I ended up near a place called Gosaz National Park. It wasn't as crowded as some other hiking areas I'd read about, and that made it perfect for me. I had my backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a map that looked like it had been folded too many times. The air smelled sharp and clean, the kind that felt fresher than anything I'd breathed in the city. The trails were winding, shaded by tall pines and scattered rocks, with streams of cold mountain water cutting through. I hiked for most of the day, sweating under the weight of my gear. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and the constant hum of insects. By late afternoon, I found a clearing not far from a river. It was flat, and the sound of rushing water made it feel safe. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and cooked a simple meal. The evening settled in quickly. The sun dipped behind the trees, and the sky turned a heavy shade of blue. I sat by the fire, listening to the crackling wood and the faint movement of the water. I remember thinking about how lucky I was to be there, away from the noise of my regular life. The forest around me seemed endless, stretching out into darkness, and I thought about how small I really was in all of it. That night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to pull me out of sleep. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something rummaging through the brush. I sat up inside my tent, listening. The fire had died down, but there was still a faint orange glow outside. The sound came again, branches snapping, slow and heavy, like someone stepping carefully but not carefully enough. I froze. My heart started pounding so hard that I could feel it in my throat. I told myself it was wildlife, nothing more. Austria had bears, lynxes, wild boars. Could have been any of them. I waited, barely breathing, and eventually the sound faded. After what felt like forever, I forced myself to lie back down, though I never really fell back into deep sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The forest looked the same, the river still ran, and the air was cool and crisp. I shook off the night and told myself not to overthink it. After breakfast, I packed up and hiked further along the trail. But as I walked, I couldn't shake a strange feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't constant, more like a prickling at the back of my neck every now and then, a sense of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but there was never anyone there. That afternoon, I came across another clearing. It was bigger than the one before, with short grass and a few boulders scattered around. I set my tent up again, collected firewood, and tried to settle in. The day stretched into evening. The forest got quieter as the light faded, the kind of silence that makes every small sound louder. As I was sitting by the fire, I saw something. At the edge of the tree line, maybe 50 feet away, there was a man. He was standing still, half hidden by the trees, just far enough that I couldn't make out his face. He wasn't moving toward me, but he wasn't walking away either. Just standing there, watching. I felt my stomach drop. My hands went cold even though the fire was warm. I didn't know what to do. My first thought was to yell, but my throat felt tight, like the sound wouldn't come out right. Instead, I sat there frozen, pretending I hadn't noticed him, but my eyes kept darting back to where he stood. After a few minutes that felt endless, he turned and walked back into the forest. Not fast, not hurried, just slow steps into the dark until I couldn't see him anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise outside the tent made me tense up. I kept my pocket knife within reach, though I knew it wouldn't do much if something really happened. My ears strained for movement, but the night dragged on, long and heavy. By morning, I was exhausted, My head throbbed from lack of sleep, but I forced myself to pack up quickly. I thought about cutting my trip short and heading back toward the main road. Still, I told myself maybe he was just another hiker. Maybe I had camped too close to where he was passing through. It didn't have to mean anything. I pushed further along the trail. The hours blurred together, the forest thick around me, the path sometimes narrowing until it felt like it was closing in. Every so often, I'd see something that made my chest tighten, what looked like a footprint in the mud, or branches bent like someone had passed through. Late in the afternoon, I stopped near another stream. I was too tired to keep going, and my legs ached from carrying the pack. I set up camp, trying to convince myself everything would be fine. But deep down, I knew I was on edge. That evening, as the fire burned low, I looked up and there he was again. Closer this time. Not at the edge of the trees, but nearer, maybe 30 feet away. Still not moving, still just standing there. His clothes looked dirty, dark jacket, loose pants, and his face was hard to see in the dim light. I could tell he was staring at me, though, and that was enough to make my skin crawl. I forced myself not to run, not to show panic, though inside I felt sick. After what felt like forever, he turned again and disappeared into the trees. I didn't even bother trying to sleep that night. I sat awake, knife in hand, eyes darting to every shadow. My body shook from adrenaline, and my thoughts wouldn't stop racing. Why was he out there? Why was he following me? At the first sign of daylight, I packed everything in record time and started back toward the road I had come from. My only goal was to get out of the forest as fast as possible. Every step felt heavier, my ears tuned to every snap of a twig behind me. I kept imagining him trailing just out of sight. Hours later, when I finally saw signs of a road and small wooden signs pointing toward a nearby village, I almost broke into a run. My legs were shaking, my mouth dry, but I didn't stop. When I reached the first group of houses, relief hit me so hard I thought I might collapse. I never saw him again. I don't know if he followed me all the way or if he stopped once I was close to the village. I'll never know who he was, why he was out there, or what he wanted. Maybe he was just some drifter, maybe worse. All I know is that he was there watching, and that was enough. Looking back now, years later, I still feel a chill when I think about it. I've camped plenty of times since then, but never alone. I don't take chances in remote places anymore. Whenever I hear a twig snap at night, I remember those nights in Austria, sitting by the fire, knowing someone was out there in the dark, staring at me. I remember that night in 2014 more clearly than I'd like to. I was 27 back then, living in Washington State, and I had this habit of going out into the woods whenever life started feeling too heavy. That summer had been busy with work, constant noise, and people always around. I wanted silence, rain, and that damp forest smell that seems to clean your head out. I decided to camp alone near an old logging trail a couple of miles outside Forks. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I'd found on a hike the year before. The day I went out started off with gray skies, heavy clouds that looked ready to split open at any moment. The air was sticky, humid, and the ground soft under my boots from storms that had passed through earlier that week. I parked my old truck off the gravel road and loaded up a pack, tent, food, sleeping bag, rifle, and a hatchet. It was already evening when I started hiking in. By the time I reached the clearing, the woods were darkening fast. The tree cover was thick, and the air smelled of moss and wet bark. I set up the tent quickly, staked it down into the soft earth, and laid out my sleeping bag inside. The quiet was overwhelming. No cars, no voices, just the sound of water dripping from branches and the low rustle of wind sliding through the pines. It started raining as soon as I got a small fire going. At first, Just a drizzle, the kind that makes everything shine under the weak light. Then, like someone turning a knob, the sky opened up. Heavy sheets of rain came down, pattering against the tarp I'd strung above my tent and hissing as they hit the fire, turning the flames into a smoking mess. Within minutes, the fire was nothing but glowing embers buried under steam. I crawled into the tent with damp clothes clinging to my skin. I stretched out in the sleeping bag, listening to the storm. The rain was so heavy it was hard to hear anything else, but after a while, the noises of the forest began to bleed through. Branches cracking, leaves rustling in sudden bursts, water gushing in little streams that hadn't been there earlier. I tried to calm myself by focusing on the rhythm of the rain, but something about the sounds outside felt off. It wasn't unusual to hear animals moving around. Deer, raccoons, maybe a bear if I was unlucky, but this felt different. The cracking wasn't random. It came in a steady pace, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the clearing. At first, I told myself it was the storm playing tricks, waterlogged trees shifting under their own weight. But the longer I lay there, the more sure I became that something or someone was walking out there. I unzipped the tent just an inch and peered out. The rain made it hard to see. Everything blurred together into a wall of gray. My flashlight beam cut through the downpour in a weak cone, landing on the black shapes of trees. Nothing moved. I kept scanning, heart pounding in my throat, until the light caught something pale in the distance. Not glowing, not bright, just pale. A flash of white, low to the ground, then gone. I pulled the zipper shut and sat still, listening. The footsteps came back, closer this time. Crunch of wet soil, the pop of twigs breaking. It circled, then stopped. The rain pounded on the nylon of the tent, but in the pauses between gusts, I swore I could hear breathing. Slow, steady, too heavy for a deer. My rifle was leaning against the side of the tent, and I slid it closer without making a sound. The hours dragged on. The storm never let up. Every time I thought the footsteps had gone, they came back. Sometimes behind me, sometimes to the left, always just far enough that I couldn't see anything when I checked. The forest smelled stronger than usual. Wet earth, sharp pine, and something sour mixed in, like sweat soaked into damp clothes. Around 2 or 3 in the morning, I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped my boots on, unzipped the tent as quietly as I could, and stepped out into the rain. My flashlight beam wavered over the clearing, catching the sheen of water on the grass and the black trunks of trees. I swung it fast, side to side, waiting for something to show itself. Nothing, just rain and darkness. Then, at the edge of the light, maybe 30 yards out, I saw a figure. It was crouched low, not standing upright, just a shape pressed against a tree. I froze, light shaking in my hand. The figure didn't move. I blinked, rubbed rain out of my eyes, and when I looked again, it was gone. No sound of running, no branches snapping, nothing. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the tent with the rifle across my lap, flashlight in my other hand, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps didn't come back. Instead, there was only silence broken by rain, long stretches of nothing that made me question whether I'd seen anything at all. My mind ran wild with thoughts I didn't want. Someone out here watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep. At first light, the rain had thinned to a drizzle. The forest looked calm, innocent even, as if the night hadn't happened at all. I stepped out with sore legs and stiff fingers, scanning the clearing. The ground was a mess of mud, crisscrossed with water trails and fallen leaves. At first, I thought the rain had erased everything, but as I walked toward the tree line, I saw them. Footprints. Not boot tracks, not paw prints. Bare feet, long, narrow, pressed deep into the soft earth. They circled the clearing in wide loops, then cut straight toward where I'd seen the figure crouching. The prints stopped at the base of a tree, and the mud was smeared there, as if something had pressed itself tight against the bark. The realization sank into me like a cold stone in the stomach. Someone had been out there all night. Not an animal, not my imagination. A person, walking barefoot in the rain, circling my camp, crouching in the dark just far enough to keep hidden. I packed up in a rush, hands shaking, eyes scanning the trees every few seconds. The hike back to the truck felt twice as long as it had the evening before. Every snapped twig made me whip my head around. Every shadow looked like it might stand up and start moving. I didn't stop until I was in the cab of the truck with the doors locked, mud dripping from my boots onto the floor mat. On the drive back, I kept replaying the night over and over, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out there in the middle of nowhere, barefoot, creeping around someone else's tent in the pouring rain? I never found out, and maybe I don't want to, but that was the last time I camped alone. No matter how much I miss the quiet of the woods, I can't shake the memory of those wet, silent footsteps circling me in the dark. I had been camping alone before, but this trip felt different from the very start. It was late September of 2017, and the air had already started carrying the sharp bite of early autumn. I was 29 then, still stubborn enough to think I could handle nights in the woods with nothing but a tent, a pack, and a few tools. I drove out past Asheville, North Carolina, away from the crowded trails and into one of those half-forgotten forest roads that most people avoid. The road was little more than 2 ruts cut into the ground, climbing upward until it ended at a wide clearing surrounded by tall, shadow-soaked pines. That was where I parked. The clearing wasn't marked on any camping map. It was just a raw patch of land where the trees had given way, maybe from an old logging cut years ago. I liked spots like that because they felt untouched. No fire rings, no picnic tables, no signs of anyone else. Just open dirt, patches of yellow grass, and the dark wall of trees on every side. That first afternoon was quiet enough to make me feel good about the choice. I pitched my small green tent a little off-center, closer to the trees so I wouldn't be in the wide open if the wind picked up. The ground was uneven, littered with pine needles and small rocks, but I made do. The first couple of hours passed without much notice. I gathered sticks for a fire, filled a bottle from a nearby creek I had found while walking the tree line, and set up my sleeping bag inside. The sun sank low before I realized how fast the shadows stretched across the clearing. By the time I got my fire going, the whole place had changed. The woods that had looked calm and inviting under sunlight now pressed inward, dense and silent, like a black curtain drawn around me. The fire cracked, throwing out pops that echoed a little too far in the stillness. It had rained earlier in the week, and the ground still gave off a damp, earthy smell. Every gust of wind carried a mix of pine and wet soil. I cooked a small meal over the flames, just canned beans heated in my pan, and ate while listening to the occasional rustle in the distance. I told myself it was squirrels or raccoons, maybe a deer stepping on fallen leaves. But the longer I sat there, the more I noticed the sounds were uneven. Not the scurrying of animals, but heavier, slower. A step, then nothing. Another step, then silence again. Always from different directions, never the same place twice. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the fire. Flames had always comforted me when camping. They made the darkness feel less total. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond the light was moving. The trees were so tightly packed that even a faint movement could hide there forever without me knowing. I thought about packing up, but it felt ridiculous. I come all this way, and it was probably just nerves. Around 10, I put the fire out so I could get some rest. The embers hissed under the splash of water, and soon only a thin smoke drifted up. Without the fire, the clearing seemed swallowed whole by the night. I crawled into the tent, zipped it tight, and lay down on my sleeping bag. I could still smell the smoke faint on my clothes. I tried to relax, focusing on the hum of insects. My body wanted to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop circling the noises outside. It wasn't long before I heard them again. Not soft rustling this time, but a definite crunch of leaves, like someone stepping carefully. I froze inside the tent, listening so hard my ears felt hot. The step came again, closer, maybe 10 yards away. I held my breath. My hand found the flashlight I'd left by the door, but I didn't dare switch it on. For nearly a minute, I heard nothing, just silence pressing against the nylon walls. Then another step, this one slower, dragging. I told myself it had to be a deer, maybe even a bear. But bears don't usually stop and wait like that. And if it was a deer, why would it keep circling at that pace? My heartbeat thudded in my chest so hard I thought the sound might give me away. I lay there, stiff, every sense sharpened to the point of pain. After a while, the steps moved again, away from me, fading into the woods. I let out the breath I'd been holding and tried to calm down. Maybe it really was an animal that had wandered close and then left. I tried to believe that, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. I just lay there, staring at the fabric inches from my face. It must have been around midnight when I heard something new. Not steps this time. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing just outside the tent. Not animal breathing, too controlled, too deliberate. My skin went cold instantly. Every muscle locked up. The sound was inches away from my head, separated only by the thin nylon wall. Whoever or whatever it was had crouched down right beside the tent. I could hear it clear as day, the faint draw in and out of lungs. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Minutes passed like that, me frozen, listening to someone breathe on the other side of the wall. At some point, the breathing stopped. I waited, not knowing if the person had gone or if they were still there, holding their breath just like me. I lay like that for hours, too scared to check, too scared to do anything. When faint light finally bled into the tent, I worked up the nerve to unzip it. My hand shook as I pulled the flap open, expecting someone to be standing there. But the clearing was empty. The fire pit was cold, the trees quiet. I scanned the ground for prints and found them almost immediately. Not boots, bare feet. At least a dozen steps pressed into the damp earth, circling the tent, some only a foot away from where I had been lying. My stomach dropped. Whoever had been there hadn't just passed through. They had walked around me again and again in the night, close enough to touch the fabric, close enough to listen. The tracks led back toward the tree line and disappeared into the shadows where the grass grew thick. I didn't waste time. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving my gear into the bag without care. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. Every sound from the woods made me think they were still watching. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone step out from between the trees. By the time I reached my car, the sun had climbed higher, but it didn't matter. The clearing still felt wrong, like the woods themselves had eyes. I started the engine and drove out, not looking back until the dirt road opened onto the paved highway. Only then did I breathe fully again. I never went back to that spot. I never even tried to find it again on a map. All I know is that someone had been out there with me, barefoot in the middle of the night, circling my tent, breathing inches away from my head. No reason. No explanation. Just there. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I was 27 in the summer of 2014 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Arizona. I had been working long weeks in construction and wanted some quiet away from the noise of the city. I picked a place outside Flagstaff, near a forest road that branched off into the Coconino National Forest. I had driven through once before with friends but never camped there. It looked far enough from people to feel wild, but not so remote that I couldn't reach the road if something went wrong. The first day went smooth. I arrived in the late afternoon, set up my tent near a clearing with tall pines on all sides, and started a small fire. I kept things simple: canned food, a folding chair, and a sleeping bag. The forest was calm. The only sounds were birds moving in the trees and the occasional rustle of wind. By sunset, I was alone with nothing but the crackling fire and the dim shapes of trees growing darker by the minute. The first night was uneventful, though I remember waking once around 3 a.m. The forest felt heavier then, silent in a way that pressed against me. I lay still in my sleeping bag, listening for movement, but after 10 minutes with nothing unusual, I drifted back to sleep. The second day, I hiked a few miles, followed a deer path uphill, and returned to camp by late afternoon. That evening, the air turned colder. I collected extra wood for the fire, enough to last the night. As darkness fell, I sat close to the flames, eating, thinking about how different the world felt without people. The stillness made every sound stand out. It was around midnight when I first noticed something off. I had killed the fire down to embers and was lying inside the tent. From the distance, maybe 50 yards away, I heard footsteps. They weren't animal-like, not quick or scattered. They were slow, heavy, and spaced apart like a person walking. I froze, listening. The steps continued, crunching on dry pine needles, then stopping, then starting again. My first thought was that maybe someone else was camping nearby and had wandered too close. But in 2 days, I hadn't seen a single car on the forest road or heard another person. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. The clearing was lit faintly by moonlight, but I didn't see anyone. The footsteps had stopped too. I sat there for a few minutes, my heart pushing fast in my chest. Eventually, I zipped the tent closed and told myself it was probably an elk moving oddly, or maybe the forest playing tricks with sound. Sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something shift outside, like someone moving slow around the edges of the clearing. By morning, everything looked normal. I forced myself to believe it was nothing, maybe just my mind exaggerating small noises in the dark. I spent the day closer to camp, cutting small branches, walking circles to get familiar with the area. I noticed boot prints near the trailhead that didn't belong to me, but I couldn't tell how old they were. That night was worse. After I put out the fire, I heard the same steps again, this time closer, circling. My tent was thin, and every sound came through sharp. Twigs snapping, needles crunching, breathing, or maybe the wind. I couldn't be sure. At one point, I thought I heard a low whine, almost like a person trying to whisper but holding it in. I stayed still for hours, gripping the handle of my hatchet inside the sleeping bag, barely blinking. At some point, I drifted into a half-sleep. That's when I woke to a sound right outside the tent. A dragging noise, like someone's hand brushing across the fabric. Then silence. I didn't move. My body felt frozen, heavy, like even the smallest shift would give me away. After what felt like an hour, the noises stopped completely. I didn't sleep after that. When daylight came, I unzipped the tent and scanned the clearing. I saw nothing out of place except for something that made my stomach tighten. About 10 feet from the tent in the dirt was a single bare footprint. Not like a normal hiker's boot, but human, wide, and long, pressed deep into the ground. The skin outline looked off, the toes longer than normal. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I told myself I was being paranoid. People talked about stories out here, strange figures, skinwalkers, things that weren't animals or humans. I didn't believe in any of it. Still, the footprint felt wrong. I made a choice to stay one more night, partly out of stubbornness and partly because I didn't want to admit fear was chasing me out. That evening, I built the fire larger, feeding it every half hour, keeping the light strong. The woods stayed quiet until around 2 a.m. Then I heard it again, those same steps, heavier this time, circling in the dark. I sat upright in the tent, hatchet in hand, listening. The fire outside had burned low, and the shadows stretched long across the clearing. I could hear something move just beyond the light's edge, pacing. Then, clear as day, came the sound of breathing. Not animal panting, not a snort, but slow, steady human breaths. I couldn't take it anymore. I shoved out of the tent, hatchet raised, scanning the clearing. The firelight flickered, and for a moment I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line. It was tall, shoulders hunched, arms longer than they should have been. Its skin looked pale in the fire's glow, and the face, what little I saw was wrong, stretched somehow, like it was wearing something that didn't fit. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent, staring. My chest felt tight, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I didn't want to turn my back. I fed wood into the fire, keeping it alive, keeping the clearing bright. For hours I sat there, eyes fixed on that line of trees. At some point, the figure was gone. I hadn't seen it leave. One moment it was there, the next it wasn't. By dawn, I had already packed everything. I didn't eat, didn't even fold the tent properly. I shoved gear into the car and drove out, hands shaking on the wheel until I hit the main highway. I never went back to that forest. I never camped alone again either. People ask me sometimes why I quit going out there, and I just say I got tired of it. I don't tell them about the footprint in the dirt, or the breathing outside my tent, or the figure at the tree line with the face that wasn't right. All I know is it was real. Not a dream, not my imagination. Something was out there those nights, and it watched me. If I had stayed longer, maybe curious or too stubborn to leave, I don't think I'd be here to write this down. I was 27 the year I went hunting alone in the mountains of Wyoming. It was October, and the air already carried the sharp bite of winter. I had taken time off work, packed my old canvas tent, a sleeping bag that smelled faintly of smoke from past trips, a .30-06 rifle, and enough food to last a week. I wanted silence, the kind you only find in the backcountry, and I wanted the satisfaction of stalking elk without anyone around. I parked my truck at the end of a dirt road, shouldered my pack, and hiked in until the sound of the highway was nothing but a memory. The first couple of days were exactly what I wanted. The forests were thick with pine, the ground damp with layers of needles that softened each step. I spent hours moving slowly, stopping often, scanning the ridges for movement. I didn't see much more than mule deer and a few turkeys, but that didn't bother me. Hunting wasn't just about the kill. It was about the weight, the focus, the discipline. At night, I built small fires, careful not to draw attention, and sat with a tin cup of coffee while the trees loomed black around me. The stars overhead were endless. On the third night, I heard something that unsettled me. I was zipped inside my sleeping bag, drifting off, when the sound of deliberate footsteps reached me. They weren't the heavy tread of an elk or bear crashing through undergrowth. These were measured, cautious steps, crunching the pine needles just beyond the firelight. My eyes shot open in the darkness, heart hammering against my ribs. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped, then started again, circling. Whoever or whatever, it was moved slowly, as if trying not to be noticed. I thought about calling out, but my throat locked up. My rifle was leaning against the tree next to me, not in my hands. I didn't move. After what felt like an hour, the sound faded into the distance. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I told myself it must have been an animal. A bear, maybe, though I had never heard one move like that before. The thought of another hunter out there crossed my mind, but it was remote country, and I hadn't seen a soul since I'd left the truck. That day, I hunted higher, pushing up through a steep drainage where the ground was slick with moss. The air was thin and cool, and clouds moved quickly across the sky. I found a spot overlooking a meadow and waited, rifle across my lap. After an hour or so, I caught movement at the tree line. First, I thought it was an elk, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, too narrow. It looked like a man standing just inside the shadows, watching the meadow. My stomach tightened. I blinked, and the figure was gone. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe it was just the way the branches had lined up. Still, I packed up sooner than I would have liked and headed back toward camp. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but the woods stayed silent. That night, I built my fire smaller, just enough to warm my hands. The silence pressed in heavier than usual. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the rifle inside with me. Hours passed in restless half-sleep until I woke again to that same sound. Footsteps outside the tent. Slow, careful. This time they came closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves just feet from the nylon wall. My pulse roared in my ears. Whoever it was paused there, standing. I gripped the rifle tight, finger brushing the cold metal of the trigger guard. No sound, no movement, just stillness. After what felt like forever, the steps retreated again, fading into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I made coffee with trembling hands, my mind racing. I walked the perimeter of camp, scanning the ground. There were tracks in the soft earth, boot prints. Not mine. Too large, too wide apart. Someone had been circling my tent, watching. The unease dug deeper into me as the day went on. I couldn't focus on hunting anymore. Every broken branch, every gust of wind through the pines, made me whip my head around. I kept seeing flashes of movement in the corner of my vision. A dark shape slipping behind a tree. A figure standing on the ridge, gone when I blinked. My chest felt tight, like the forest itself was pressing in. By late afternoon, I decided I was done. I couldn't spend another night out there with whoever was following me. I packed up quickly, stuffing gear into my pack, stamping out the fire until smoke curled weakly in the cold air. The hike back to the truck was nearly 10 miles, but I pushed hard, rifle slung over my shoulder, eyes scanning constantly. The forest grew darker as the sun dropped. I told myself I'd be fine once I reached the truck. I was less than a mile away when I heard it again. Footsteps behind me keeping pace. I froze, listening. The woods went quiet. I started walking again, faster now. The steps returned, crunching in rhythm with mine, then pausing whenever I stopped. My throat went dry. I broke into a jog, stumbling on roots, sweat pouring down despite the cold air. The footsteps stayed with me, never rushing, just steady, deliberate. It felt like whoever was there knew exactly how far they could push me without showing themselves. Finally, the road came into view through the trees. My truck sat alone at the trailhead, silver paint gleaming dully in the fading light. Relief washed through me, but it was cut short. On the hood of my truck, scratched deep into the metal, were 2 words, "Not yet." My stomach dropped. I scanned the tree lean, rifle raised, but the woods were empty, silent, as if nothing had ever been there. My hands shook as I unlocked the truck, tossed my gear in, and slammed the door. I didn't look back as I gunned the engine and sped down the gravel road, tires spitting rocks. I drove for hours before stopping at a gas station lit by buzzing fluorescent lights. Only then did I let myself breathe. The scratches on the hood were real, deep grooves catching the light. Someone had been out there watching me, stalking me, toying with me. I never went back to that stretch of mountains. I sold my gear a few weeks later. People asked why, and I just said I was done hunting. The truth was harder to explain. Out there in the silence, I realized there are people who treat the wilderness like a game, and sometimes the prey isn't the animal you're chasing. It's you. I was 27 years old the first time I went on a camping trip alone. It was the summer of 2014, late July, and I had a few days off from work that lined up with a heat wave rolling across central Oregon. I had been reading about a cluster of lakes up in the Cascades, tucked behind miles of rough forest roads that weren't popular with casual tourists. The idea of quiet, no cell service, and just me with a tent and a fire felt like the break I needed. I drove up in the late afternoon in my old silver pickup, the bed filled with gear. A cheap dome tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler full of food and drinks, a lantern, and my hunting knife. I wasn't planning on hunting, but I liked carrying it as a tool, in case I needed to cut rope or split firewood. The drive itself already felt a little unsettling. The paved highway turned into gravel, and then the gravel shrank into a narrow track that snaked between thick walls of pine and fir. My truck rattled and bounced over roots and potholes, and every so often I had to stop to move a fallen branch out of the way. By the time I found a flat patch of ground near one of the smaller lakes, the sun was already sliding low. The place was beautiful but felt strangely isolated. The lake was glassy and still, ringed with tall reeds and heavy trees leaning over the water. There were no picnic tables, no marked campgrounds, just raw forest floor. The air smelled like pine needles and damp earth. I parked the truck in a spot where the trees opened a little, unloaded my gear, and set up the tent just a few yards from the water's edge. The first night was fine. I built a small fire, cooked a couple of hot dogs on a stick, and sat there listening to the distant creaks of the forest. Every now and then I heard something splash in the lake, probably a fish or maybe a beaver. I slept surprisingly well, stretched out in my sleeping bag with the tent flap half open for air. The woods were quiet enough that the sound of crickets lulled me out. It was the second night when things changed. That day I hiked a ridge that climbed above the lake. I left early, around 9 in the morning, carrying only a bottle of water and a granola bar. The trail was faint, more of a game path, but I followed it until I came out on a rocky overlook with a wide view of the basin. Down below, I could see the little lake where I was camped, a round mirror tucked between the trees. What caught me off guard, though, was that I could also make out a thin column of smoke on the far side of the lake. It wasn't thick like a forest fire, just a thread rising straight up. Someone else must have been camping out there. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I actually felt a bit relieved. Being alone in the forest had a way of making the silence too heavy, so knowing someone else was around, even across the water, settled me. I got back to my camp by mid-afternoon, hot and sweaty from the climb. I cooled off in the shallows of the lake, then ate a quick meal and spent the rest of the evening reading a paperback by the fire. But once darkness settled in, something about the forest felt different. It started with small noises. A branch snapped somewhere across the lake. I froze, listening, but then brushed it off as a deer moving through. Later, while I was sitting by the fire, I thought I saw something, just a flicker, between the tree trunks on the opposite shore. Figure, maybe, but the distance and shadows made it impossible to be sure. I doused the fire before turning in, crawling into the tent and zipping the flap shut. I lay there with my headlamp turned off, the forest pressing down in silence. That's when I heard it, footsteps, slow, deliberate, crunching across the dry pine needles outside. They weren't animal footsteps. They had a rhythm, one after the other, a person moving carefully. I held my breath. The steps came closer, stopped, and then started again, circling the edge of my campsite. My knife was in my pack by the tent wall, and I fumbled for it in the dark, fingers shaking. I stayed still, heart thudding so loud I thought it would give me away. The steps moved past the tent, paused again, and then faded back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. Every sound made me jump. At some point in the night, I caught the faint sound of water splashing, as if someone were wading along the shoreline. I sat up in my bag, straining to listen, until it stopped. By dawn, I was exhausted but too on edge to stay another night. I packed up quickly, tossing gear into the truck without much care. As I walked back and forth from the tent to the truck bed, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. On the soft dirt near the fire pit, there were fresh boot prints. They weren't mine. The tread pattern was different, wider, deeper. Someone had been standing just a few feet from my tent. I didn't wait around. I slammed the tailgate, climbed into the cab, and started the truck. The road out was rougher than I remembered, and my tires kicked up rocks as I pushed faster than I should have. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see someone following. When I finally hit pavement again and got cell service, I pulled over and sat there for a long while, just breathing. I thought about what I'd heard, the footsteps, the splashing, and the prints by the fire. Whoever it was had come into my camp in the middle of the night, close enough to touch the tent if they wanted. They hadn't stolen anything, hadn't made a sound beyond walking, but the intention behind it didn't feel innocent. I've camped since then, but never alone again. I stick to marked campgrounds now, places where other people are within shouting distance. That trip taught me that the scariest thing out in the woods isn't a bear or a cougar. It's another person. Someone who doesn't announce themselves, who just walks into your space in the middle of the night and leaves nothing but tracks behind. Every now and then, I think about the thin smoke I saw across the lake. Maybe that was their camp. Maybe they watched me from the start. I'll never know. But I do know that when I left that place, I wasn't leaving behind just the trees and water. I was leaving behind whoever had been standing outside my tent in the dark, listening to me breathe. I was 23 when I decided to drive west across the United States. It was late summer of 2004, and I had just finished college in Ohio. I had some savings, an old green Ford Explorer, and a cheap two-person tent I bought at a discount store. I didn't plan on staying in motels much. I thought I could save money and experience more if I camped along the way. I had always been comfortable in the woods, so I didn't think much about it. By the time I reached South Dakota, the long highways started to feel endless. I had driven for hours past farmland, then through empty stretches where it felt like no one lived for miles. That evening, just before sunset, I pulled into a small dirt road off the highway. There was no real sign, just a weathered wooden post that looked like it had once held a marker. The road led into a thick patch of trees, and I figured it would make a decent place to stop for the night. The air was warm but carried that faint chill that told me fall was creeping in. I set up my tent on a flat patch of ground not too far from my truck. The soil was soft and covered in pine needles, and I could smell sap sticking to the air. I cooked a small meal on my little gas stove, just beans and rice from a can, and ate while the sun dipped behind the trees. When the light faded, I zipped myself into the tent with a flashlight, notebook, and bottle of water. The woods around me were quiet, except for the steady buzz of insects. I had camped alone before, but there was something heavier about this place. It was quieter than I expected. No distant sound of cars on a highway, no planes overhead, just silence broken by crickets. I lay on top of my sleeping bag, reading by flashlight, until I started to feel drowsy. Around midnight, I switched off the light and listened to the forest as I drifted towards sleep. Somewhere in the dark, a noise woke me. It wasn't loud at first, just a faint crunch of leaves. I thought it might be a raccoon or a deer, so I stayed still and waited. The sound came again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate step, then another. It wasn't the quick scurry of an animal. It was heavier, human. I held my breath, staring at the thin fabric of the tent where faint moonlight filtered through. My heart started hammering. I told myself maybe it was just my imagination, maybe the wind, but the steps continued. They circled around my tent, slow and steady, stopping now and then, like whoever it was listening for me. I froze. My flashlight was near my head, but I didn't dare reach for it. My truck was about 20 feet away, but I would have to unzip the tent and sprint. If someone was waiting, I wouldn't make it. I just lay there, barely breathing, listening as the steps shifted from one side of the tent to the other. Minutes dragged by like hours. My ears strained at every sound, the faint snap of a twig, the rustle of a branch. At one point, something brushed against the fabric of the tent. A hand, maybe, or a sleeve. The nylon sagged slightly inward before pulling back. My throat went dry. I wanted to shout, but my voice felt locked inside me. Eventually, the steps drifted away. I lay there in silence for a long time, trying to convince myself they were gone. I don't know how much time passed before I dozed off again, but I woke just before dawn. The first thing I did was unzip the tent and crawl out into the pale gray light. The forest looked calm, but the ground told a different story. There were footprints in the dirt, circling the tent in uneven loops. They weren't boots or heavy shoes, just worn sneakers. The prints were fresh, pressed deep into the soft soil. My stomach knotted as I realized someone had definitely been out there, watching me while I slept. I wasted no time. I packed my tent, stove, and gear in under 10 minutes, tossing things haphazardly into the back of the Explorer. The urge to leave was overwhelming, but I forced myself to scan the tree line before starting the engine. I didn't see anyone. I drove back down the dirt road and onto the highway, my hands tight on the wheel. The whole day, I couldn't shake the thought that someone had followed me out there. Why? There were no houses nearby, no campsites, no reason for anyone else to be in those woods. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just another camper passing through. Maybe they were curious and left when they realized someone was inside. But that didn't explain why they circled my tent so quietly, why they touched it. That night, I stopped at a real campground near Rapid City, one with other cars, families, and lights. I parked close to the bathrooms and left my tent packed. I slept in the back of the Explorer with the doors locked. Every sound made me twitch awake. The slam of another camper's car door, the bark of a dog, even the wind rustling the canvas awnings nearby. I realized then that the trip didn't feel adventurous anymore. It felt dangerous. For the rest of that journey, I stayed in campgrounds or cheap motels. I never again pulled off into some random patch of woods to set up for the night. The thought of those slow footsteps circling me in the dark never left my head. Looking back now, over 20 years later, I still don't know what their intent was. Maybe it was nothing more than someone wandering drunk or lost. Maybe it was someone with darker plans who changed their mind. What I do know is that being alone in the woods, hidden away where no one knows you are, makes you vulnerable in a way you don't feel until it happens. The silence of that night wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses against your ears, where every small sound feels magnified, where you realize just how far you are from help. I can still picture the outline of those footprints in the dirt, circling like a warning. That night taught me something I never forgot. Fear doesn't need ghosts or monsters. Sometimes it's just the sound of footsteps outside your tent and the knowledge that someone is out there, watching, while you're trapped inside with nothing but thin nylon between you and them. I still remember that trip like it happened yesterday, even though it's been years. It was late September, 2006, when I decided to take a week off work and head out to the woods in northern Montana. Hunting season had just opened, and I wanted to get away from people, noise, and the usual grind. I was 28 at the time, in decent shape, and thought I could handle being alone out there. I had done smaller trips before, but this one was the farthest I had ever gone in. I loaded my truck with a tent, gear, food, and my old Remington rifle, and drove nearly 6 hours until the paved road turned into gravel and then into dirt, the kind that rattled your bones as you drove. The sun was already slipping behind the ridges when I parked at a small pull-off that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. My plan was to hike about 3 miles into the tree line, set up camp, and hunt deer at dawn. The air was crisp, and the woods were silent except for the crunch of my boots and the occasional snap of a branch under the weight of my pack. There was no cell service out there, which was normal for the area, and I felt that mix of freedom and unease that always came with being totally cut off. I found a decent flat spot by a slow stream, cleared some brush, and set up my tent. By the time the fire was going, the forest had turned dark. I ate a quick meal of jerky and beans, then sat with my back against a log, watching the flames. The forest noises slowly picked up again after I settled. Crickets, an owl somewhere deeper in the trees, and the distant rush of the stream. I kept my rifle close, as I always did, more out of habit than actual fear. The first night passed without much happening, but I kept waking up. The noises outside the tent seemed louder than usual. Twigs snapped here and there, and once I heard something sloshing in the stream. Every sound was amplified by the thin tent fabric. I told myself it was just deer moving through, maybe raccoons or something. By morning, I was tired but ready to start. That first day hunting went mostly as planned. I tracked through the ridges, spotted a few does but no bucks, and by late afternoon my legs were burning. I made it back to camp just before the sun dipped again. As I cooked, I noticed the woods had gone quiet faster than the night before. Usually there's that long, slow fade as birds stop calling, but this time it felt like someone had just switched everything off. Put me on edge, though I tried to brush it off. That night I couldn't sleep again. I lay on my back staring at the tent ceiling, ears straining. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like footsteps. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Not the scattered movement of a deer or the quick scuttle of a raccoon. It circled my camp, crunching the underbrush. I grabbed my rifle and held it across my chest, hardly breathing. The steps would stop for long stretches, then start again on the other side. I wanted to believe it was a bear, but bears don't usually walk that carefully, and they don't stop and start like that. Eventually, the sound faded away into the distance, and I must have drifted into a half-sleep. When I unzipped the tent at dawn, there were no tracks I could clearly make out, just disturbed leaves here and there. I told myself maybe it had been the wind moving branches, though deep down I didn't believe it. The third day hunting, I went farther out, maybe 5 or 6 miles from camp. I came across some old logging trails, overgrown and nearly erased by time. Something about them felt strange, like I shouldn't be there, though I couldn't say why. I saw fresh deer scat and some broken branches, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stopped, it felt like something else stopped too. When I turned my head quick, there was nothing, just trees and shadows. By the time I got back, the sun was low, and I was worn out. I didn't even feel like making a fire, but I forced myself to. The comfort of the flames was the only thing keeping me from losing my nerves. As the fire burned down, I noticed something out past the glow. Between the trees, maybe 30 yards out, I saw movement, a figure standing still. Not an animal shape, not 4 legs, upright. My stomach dropped. I blinked hard, and when I looked again, it was gone. I stayed up all night, rifle in my lap, fire dying to embers, eyes straining into the dark. Every rustle made me tense. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning I wanted to leave, but I told myself I was just spooked. I had put too much time and effort into this trip to pack up over shadows and sounds. Still, I didn't go far that day, just stuck close to camp, gathered wood, tried to keep busy. Around midday, I found something that made my blood run cold. Behind a line of pines, maybe 100 yards from my tent, there was a deer carcass. It wasn't fresh. The ribs were torn open, flesh half rotted. But the way it was laid out didn't look natural. It wasn't scattered like coyotes had gotten it. It was almost posed, legs stiff, skull tilted toward the trees. I couldn't stop staring at it. That unease in my stomach turned into real fear. Something wasn't right. I went back to camp and started packing a few things, thinking I might head back to the truck that night. But as the sun went down, I froze. The footsteps came back, closer this time. They circled again, slow, careful. I could hear breathing, low, steady breaths, too heavy to be a deer. My firelight flickered on the trunks around me, but nothing stepped into view. I sat with my rifle aimed at the dark, every muscle tight, heart hammering. Hours passed. At some point, the sound stopped. I waited, tense, until the first gray light touched the sky. As soon as I could see, I tore down camp. My hands shook as I shoved everything into my pack. I didn't care about leaving things behind, I just wanted out. The hike back to the truck felt twice as long as the way in. I kept looking over my shoulder, sure I'd see something following. At one point, I thought I saw a figure move between two trees on the ridge above me, but when I stopped and stared, nothing moved. I didn't even breathe until I saw the glint of my truck through the brush. When I reached it, I threw my gear in the bed without caring how it landed, jumped in, and started the engine. Gravel spun under the tires as I pulled away. I didn't stop until I hit pavement. Hours later, when my hands finally stopped shaking enough to grip the wheel steady. I never went back to that spot. I still hunt, but never alone and never that deep in. People ask me why I avoid northern Montana, and I just tell them the woods don't feel right out there. I never tell the full story, because the truth is I don't know what was out there. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a deer, and it wasn't just my imagination. Something was watching me for days, close enough to circle my camp, close enough to drag down a deer and leave it in plain sight. The way it moved, the way it waited, it wasn't normal. I got out, but I'll never forget the feeling that I barely did. And to this day, every time I sit by a fire in the woods, I can still hear those slow, careful footsteps in the dark. I was 26 the summer I decided to camp alone for the first time. I had been camping before with friends, but never by myself. I thought it would be a test of patience, a way to disconnect from everything, and maybe even prove something to myself. I drove out to northern Michigan, early June of 2013, and set up near the edge of a long dirt trail that wound into thick forest. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I had found earlier on a map. I liked the idea of being away from people, away from all the usual noise. By the time I parked my old sedan on the side of the trail and carried my gear down, the sky was already shifting to that late evening blue. The woods smelled damp, heavy with pine and the sweet odor of wet leaves. Mosquitoes hovered near the water that trickled somewhere downhill, their buzzing already annoying. I found a flat patch of ground not far from a cluster of birch trees and set up my tent. The nylon crackled as I tugged it into place, the sound sharp against the quiet of the woods. I cooked a small meal on my portable stove, beans and rice with a bit of sausage mixed in. The flame hissed low, and the smoke carried into the trees. By the time I finished eating, the light had nearly gone. A thin breeze picked up, and the forest began to feel different. The air grew colder, and every snap of a branch seemed louder than it should have been. I crawled into my tent and zipped the flap shut. I tried reading with my flashlight, but the words on the page blurred as the sounds outside pressed closer. The constant dripping of water from the trees mixed with the occasional crack of twigs. I reminded myself that deer moved through forests all the time. Raccoons too. It was normal. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to rain tapping hard against the tent. The nylon rippled with each gust of wind, and water slid down in heavy sheets. The air inside was clammy, damp. I shifted in my sleeping bag, listening to the storm, but then I caught something else. Beneath the rain, there was a crunch. Slow, heavy footsteps pressing into wet ground. I froze. The sound moved from one side of the clearing to the other. It wasn't an animal's random scurry. It had rhythm, weight. I held my breath, straining to hear past the rain. The steps paused near my tent. I could feel the ground faintly vibrate beneath me, as if whoever it was had stopped just a few feet away. My mouth went dry. I had no weapon, just a dull pocket knife and the little hatchet I used for firewood. I lay completely still, my heart beating so fast it made my chest ache. The rain masked some of the noise, but I swore I heard breathing. A long exhale, steady and human. Minutes dragged. Then the steps shifted again, moving off into the trees. I stayed motionless, ears straining. The sounds faded, but I didn't dare move for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under again, though every nerve in me stayed tense. When I woke in the gray light of morning, the forest looked soaked, steam rising off the ground as the sun crept higher. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed it, but when I unzipped the tent and stepped out, I saw them. Footprints. They weren't boots or sneakers. They were barefoot, wide, and pressed deep into the mud. Whoever had been out there walked close enough that one print sat barely a yard from where my head had been inside the tent. The tracks trailed off into the birch trees, disappearing where the ground grew firmer. I packed quickly, stuffing gear into my bag with shaking hands. The whole idea of staying another night made my stomach churn. Still, I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe it was some drifter or hiker. Maybe they hadn't known I was there. By afternoon, I convinced myself not to give up. I had driven hours out here, and part of me refused to let fear chase me off so soon. I spent the day fishing at a stream a short walk from the clearing. The water was cold and clear, and I managed to catch a few small trout. I built a fire when I got back, cooking them in foil, the smell of charred skin filling the air. It almost felt normal again, almost safe. But as night drew in, unease crept back. The forest grew too still. Even the insects seemed quieter, as if everything knew something I didn't. I piled extra wood on the fire, letting the flames rise taller, the smoke thicker. I didn't want darkness pressing too close. I stayed awake as long as I could, staring into the fire until my eyes burned. Around midnight, when the fire had sunk into glowing embers, I heard it again. Footsteps, not rushed, not careless, slow, deliberate. My chest tightened as I sat perfectly still in my chair, the small hatchet resting across my lap. The sound circled, around the edge of the firelight, between the trunks. Whoever it was, they stayed just out of sight. I could hear wet leaves shifting, twigs snapping under weight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake until the gray of dawn returned. When the first light hit, I saw movement between the trees, just at the edge of vision. A figure slipping back into the thicker woods, tall, thin, moving with a strange calm. That was it. I knew I couldn't stay. I broke camp in silence, barely eating, stuffing wet nylon and gear into the car with shaking hands. As I slammed the trunk shut, I glanced back one last time. On the edge of the clearing, there was a tree, and on its bark, carved deep with something sharp, was a shape. Not words, not letters, just a jagged spiral cut into the trunk. Fresh, the wood still pale against the darker bark. It hadn't been there when I arrived. Driving out along that long dirt road, the silence of the forest pressed heavy. Every turn of the tires over gravel seemed too loud, too vulnerable. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again, miles away from the trail. I never went back. For weeks, I replayed the sounds in my head. The breathing outside the tent, the barefoot prints in the mud, the figure moving just out of sight. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was some hermit living off the land, maybe just another camper wandering too close. But the carving in the tree, fresh and deliberate, never fit any harmless explanation. The worst part was how quiet they had been. Not rushing me, not yelling, not even trying to make contact. Just watching, close enough to touch the thin nylon of my tent while I slept. Close enough to know exactly where I was. I had gone out there to prove I could handle the solitude, that I could face being alone. Instead, I learned something else, that the scariest thing about the woods at night isn't the animals or the weather or even being lost. It's knowing that sometimes someone else is out there too, and they don't want you to know why. I had been planning a solo trip through Austria for a long time. I wanted something different, something that pulled me away from the noise of cities, and camping in the woods there sounded perfect. It was the summer of 2014, and I had just turned 24. I carried a simple pack with a tent, a sleeping bag, and enough food to last me several days. My plan was to hike through some of the more quiet trails and camp along the way, away from the common tourist spots. On the third day of my trip, I found myself near the edge of a forested valley not far from the town of Mariazell. The sun was setting behind the mountain ridges, turning the sky a pale orange. I followed a narrow path into the woods until I came across a small clearing with soft grass, perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent quickly before the light faded, then sat down to eat some bread and cheese I had brought with me. The woods were quiet, but not in the calm way I expected. There was almost no sound, no birds calling, no wind in the branches, just the occasional drip of water somewhere deep in the forest. I told myself it was nothing unusual, maybe just the time of day. But that silence pressed on me while I ate, and I couldn't help but glance around more than usual. As night settled in, I lit a small campfire. The crackle of the flames made me feel safer, like the noise could push away the stillness around me. I watched the fire for a long time, trying to let my mind rest. After an hour or so, I packed everything up neatly, put out the flames, and crawled into my tent. The ground was firm but not uncomfortable, and soon I was lying in my sleeping bag, listening. It was close to midnight when I first heard it. The faint crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Slow, uneven steps like someone walking without care. I froze instantly. I told myself it might be a deer or some other animal, but the sound was wrong. Too steady, too deliberate. I held my breath and listened. The steps moved closer, then paused, then shifted again. I carefully unzipped the tent flap just an inch and peeked out. The clearing was faintly lit by the moonlight, the grass silver under the pale glow. At first, I didn't see anything. Then, at the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of trees, I saw her. A woman. She stood there, half hidden in the shadows, her face pale against the dark trunks. She was wearing something long, maybe a dress or coat. I couldn't tell from that distance. Her hair hung loose and she didn't move. She just stood there, watching. My stomach dropped. I pulled back inside the tent quickly and shut the flap. I tried to convince myself it was just a local, maybe out for a night walk. But who wanders into the woods at midnight, far from any houses? And why stand there silently, staring at me? The footsteps started again. Slow, dragging, moving around the clearing. I could hear the grass shifting as she walked closer. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely think. I didn't dare make a sound. After what felt like forever, the sounds faded. I lay there stiff, waiting, ears straining for any hint of movement. Nothing. Minutes stretched into hours. At some point, exhaustion pulled me into an uneasy sleep. When I woke, the sun was up and the forest looked normal again. Birds were singing, the air was cool, and there was no sign of anything unusual. I climbed out of the tent, feeling both relieved and unsettled. I walked around the clearing, checking the edges. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint but visible in the damp soil. Bare feet. The prints led from the treeline to just a few steps away from my tent, then back again. I packed my gear quickly, barely touching my breakfast. I wanted to get away from that spot as soon as possible. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and I forced myself to keep moving, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. All day I hiked, pushing harder than usual. My legs ached, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, certain I'd see her again. Once, in the distance, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement among the trees, a pale shape between the branches, but when I stopped to look, it was gone. By late afternoon, I reached another clearing near a small stream. I considered pushing further, but my body was too tired. I set up camp again, trying to convince myself it had just been my imagination. Maybe someone had been passing through last night. Maybe the footprints weren't even from her. As darkness fell, the forest went quiet again. The silence was worse this time because I knew what might come with it. I didn't make a fire that night, too afraid of drawing attention. I lay in the tent, every muscle tense, listening. Hours passed. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement. I started to think maybe I'd been lucky. Maybe she hadn't followed me. My eyes grew heavy. Just as I was about to drift off, I heard it again. That slow crunch. Closer this time, not at the edge of the clearing, but just outside my tent. My chest tightened as I realized she was right there. I didn't move, didn't even breathe too loudly. A shadow fell across the thin fabric of the tent, and I saw the outline of her form, tall and still. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She just stood there for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, the shadow shifted. I heard the soft steps moving away into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the small knife I carried, my hand shaking the entire time. When the light finally came, I crawled out of the tent. The grass was flattened near the entrance, footprints pressed into the soil, circling the tent. My throat went dry. I packed everything without eating, without thinking. I walked fast, then faster, until I broke into a run down the trail, not caring how heavy my pack felt or how raw my feet became. I didn't stop until I reached a small village miles away. I found a guest house there, rented a room, and locked the door behind me. That was the last night I ever camped alone. Even now, years later, I remember her face in the moonlight, pale and blank, her eyes fixed on me. There was no ghost, no fairy tale, nothing supernatural. She was real, a real woman, barefoot in the woods at midnight, circling my tent in the silence. And the worst part is I never found out why. I was 27 years old when I decided to take a camping trip by myself in the summer of 2015. I had done a lot of hikes and a few overnights in the past, but I had never camped completely alone for more than one night. I wanted to push myself a little, to get away from the noise of work and city life, and just be in the woods with nothing but my tent, my gear, and the sound of nature. I drove out to northern Minnesota, a few hours away from Duluth, near an area of state forest that wasn't too crowded. It was a weekday in late July, and the forecast called for rain, but I didn't mind. Rain had never bothered me, and I thought it might even make the woods feel more peaceful. By late afternoon, I had parked my truck at the small gravel lot at the trailhead. There were no other cars around, which I thought was a good sign. I'd have the place to myself. I strapped on my pack, locked up, and started down the trail. The forest was thick with pines and birches, their trunks dark with dampness. The air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves and moss. I hiked about 3 miles in until I found a small clearing not far from a creek. It wasn't a designated campsite, but it had a flat spot for my tent and a decent tree cover. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and built a small fire with some of the drier wood I could find. The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky was darkening in a way that told me it would be here soon. After cooking some food over the fire, I sat back on a log and listened to the forest. The only sounds were the trickle of the creek and the distant rumble of thunder. By nightfall, the storm came in. The rain started as a drizzle, then quickly turned into a steady downpour. I climbed into my tent, zipped everything up, and lay back in my bag. The sound of the rain hitting the nylon was constant, almost hypnotic. For a while, I felt safe, tucked away in my little shelter, the fire outside long gone to steam and smoke. But around midnight, I woke up to a noise that didn't belong to the storm. It was faint at first, something like crunching, the sound of weight pressing into wet leaves. My first thought was that it might be a deer moving through the clearing. I tried to ignore it, telling myself the rain made everything sound closer than it was. But the sound didn't fade. It got louder, more deliberate, heavy steps, not the skittish darting of a deer or the light hopping of a raccoon. These were slow, steady movements. I held my breath and listened. Whoever or whatever it was circling. I could hear the wet brush moving, the faint snap of twigs under boots or paws. I sat up carefully, making sure not to make too much noise. The storm muffled a lot, but inside my tent, every sound I made felt amplified. I reached for the small hatchet I had brought and kept it close. The steps came closer to my tent. I could hear breathing now, not animal huffing, but low, human-like breaths, controlled but heavy. My chest tightened. I didn't dare move the zipper to peek out, because the light from my flashlight would give me away. All I could do was sit there, listening, gripping the hatchet with clammy hands. The footsteps stopped right outside. The rain was pounding so hard on the tent that I couldn't see a shadow, but I felt the presence there. My skin crawled. I waited, frozen, for what felt like minutes. Then, slowly, the steps began again, circling the tent, dragging slightly through the mud. I couldn't stop thinking about how alone I was. My truck was 3 miles away. I had no cell service out here. If something happened, no one would hear me. Eventually, the steps grew fainter, fading into the storm. I stayed awake, wide-eyed, for hours, listening to the rain and every creak of the forest. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. When I woke up in the gray light of morning, everything was soaked. The storm had eased into a drizzle. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed the whole thing. Maybe it had just been the wind or branches falling in the night. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, stretching my stiff body. But then I saw them. Footprints. Not animal prints. Human prints. Clear as day in the mud around my campsite. They circled my tent in uneven loops, sometimes close enough that whoever it was could have reached out and touched the fabric. The prints were larger than mine, made by boots with a thick tread. I followed them a little and saw they led back into the woods, disappearing into the wet undergrowth. I felt sick. Whoever had been out there had walked right up to my tent in the middle of the night, stood there listening, maybe watching, and then left without saying a word. I tried to tell myself it could have been another camper, someone passing through. But if it was, why hadn't they said anything? Why sneak around someone's tent at midnight in the pouring rain? I didn't waste time packing. I stuffed my sleeping bag into my pack, tore down the tent in minutes, and shoved everything inside, not caring if it was wet or dirty. The whole time I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there at the edge of the clearing. The hike back to the truck was the longest 3 miles of my life. Every step through the slick mud and wet brush felt like I was being followed, even though I didn't hear anyone. The rain picked up again halfway through, soaking me to the skin, but I didn't slow down. I didn't stop until I reached the gravel lot. My truck was there, just as I left it. But the first thing I noticed was the mud on the driver's side door. A smear, like someone with wet hands had touched it. My stomach dropped. I couldn't tell if it had been there when I parked, but in that moment, it felt like confirmation. Someone had been out there, maybe watching me from the moment I arrived. I jumped inside, locked the doors, and sat for a minute with my hands gripping the wheel, trying to calm my breathing. Then I started the engine and drove out of there as fast as I could, not looking back. I never went back to that forest again. I still camp, but never alone and never that far off a main trail. People always imagine danger in the form of wild animals or storms. But the truth is, the scariest part about being in the woods is knowing that you're isolated. And if someone wants to mess with you, there's nothing stopping them. That night taught me that it isn't the wilderness you have to fear. It's the people who move silently in it. I was 21 when I went on that camping trip, back in the summer of 2015. I was in New Mexico with a beat-up Ford Ranger and just enough gear stuffed in the back to keep me comfortable for a few nights. I didn't have a set plan, just wanted to get out of town, away from people, and spend some time in the quiet. I picked a spot near the Carson National Forest, not too far from Taos, where the ground was dry and flat enough for a tent, but still surrounded by trees thick enough to give me some privacy. The first day was calm. I set up my tent, lit a small fire, cooked a cheap meal on a pan, and just sat with the sound of crickets and the occasional call of some bird echoing in the distance. I walked a little bit, explored around the site, nothing out of the ordinary. By sundown, I was tired enough to crawl into my sleeping bag and knock out fast. That first night, though, I woke up sometime past midnight to a strange noise. It wasn't an animal sound I could place right away. It was like a person walking, but not steady, not natural. The ground outside my tent crunched with slow, dragging steps, circling around. I froze in my sleeping bag. My first thought was maybe a deer, but the steps were too heavy, too deliberate. I didn't move, didn't breathe loud, just listened. After what felt like forever, the sound faded off toward the woods. I told myself it was nothing and eventually went back to sleep, but my nerves were shot. The next morning, I stepped out and saw tracks around the tent. They weren't boots. They weren't animal prints either. They looked like bare human feet, but the size was off. The heels pressed deeper than the toes, like whoever made them was putting more weight into their steps than normal. The strangest part was the spacing too long, like they had been walking with an awkward stride. I crouched down and stared at them for a while, uneasy, then shook it off. I'd seen enough weird things camping before to know sometimes it's better not to overthink. That day, I hiked a few miles into the woods, trying to shake off the weird feeling. I didn't see a single person out there, which was strange in itself, considering it was summer. Usually, you'd at least hear a distant ATV or voices, but it was silent, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of something small moving in the underbrush. I got back to camp in the late afternoon, cooked some beans and rice, and sat by the fire until dark. The second night was worse. I couldn't sleep right away, kept tossing and turning, listening to the forest. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. The steps, slow, dragging, circling, but this time they stopped right outside the tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body locked tight. Then came this sound, a low, broken voice. It wasn't words, not clear ones, but something like mumbling. My stomach dropped because it sounded like someone trying to speak but not knowing how. The mumbling stretched out, then stopped, and I heard breathing. Slow, heavy, steady breathing, inches from where I lay. I reached slowly for the hatchet I kept next to my sleeping bag, gripping the handle tight. For a long time, the thing, whatever it was, stood there breathing. Then, without warning, the steps started again, moving off into the woods. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. By morning, I was ready to pack up and leave, but stubbornness kept me there. I come all this way to clear my head, and I wasn't going to let some weirdo or animal scare me off. I convinced myself it was probably just someone messing around, maybe a local drunk wandering too far from home. I spent that day closer to camp, chopping wood, reading, and staying near the fire. But the third night broke me. I had fallen asleep early, dead tired from barely sleeping the night before. At some point, maybe past midnight, I woke up to a sound that froze me cold. It was my own name being called. Not yelled, not asked, just said, flat, like someone repeating it for the first time. My name, in this low, broken tone, stretched out wrong. The fire had gone out by then, and the woods outside were black. The only light came from the moon shining through the thin nylon of the tent. My skin prickled all over. Whoever or whatever was out there, they knew my name. I'd never told anyone I was coming out here. Then came the sound of steps again, but faster this time, circling, stopping, circling again. Every instinct I had screamed to run, but I couldn't force myself to move. I lay there gripping the hatchet, praying for the night to end. Then, out of nowhere, the tent wall shifted inward, like a hand had pressed against it. I swung the hatchet hard into the fabric, not caring if I hit anything. The sound stopped. Silence swallowed the woods. I didn't sleep again. I sat upright, hatchet in hand, waiting for daylight. When the sun finally rose, I stumbled out, shaking. The tracks were there again, circling the tent, but worse this time. The footprints weren't just large, they were twisted. Some looked like they'd been made by bare feet, others like hooves, but the shape was wrong, like whoever left them couldn't decide how to walk. That was it. I packed up everything in a rush, barely caring how it fit into the truck bed. As I drove out on the dirt road, I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see someone chasing me. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway, and even then, I didn't breathe right until I was back in town. I never went camping alone after that. I told myself it was just some sick person playing games, but deep down, I knew better. The way it moved, the way it sounded, the way it tried to use my name, it wasn't normal. Something was out there in those woods, and it wasn't supposed to be. Even now, years later, I can still hear it if I think too hard about those nights. The dragging steps, the broken voice, the way it breathed outside the tent. Every time I hear footsteps in the dark, part of me tenses up, waiting for it to come back. I'll never forget that feeling, that raw fear of knowing something was out there, watching me, learning me. I left New Mexico not long after and never went back. I don't tell many people about it because they wouldn't believe me anyway, but I know what I heard. I know what I saw in those prints around my tent. And I know, without a doubt, I'll never camp alone in the woods again. I had been wanting to get out of the city for months. Work was draining me and the noise never stopped. In August of 2016, when I was 26, I finally took a week off. I drove out to Montana with all my gear packed in the back of my old Ford, planning to camp deep in the woods. I wanted silence, the kind you don't get when you live next to traffic and sirens. I had studied a couple of maps, found a national forest area where dispersed camping was allowed, and marked down a few remote spots. I set up my camp near a slow, shallow creek. The trees around me were tall pines, thick enough to block out most of the sky. The air smelled like sap and damp soil, and the only sounds were the water trickling over rocks and the occasional bird. My tent sat on a flat patch of dirt, maybe 50 yards from the creek. I had a small fire ring built from stones, a folding chair, and my cooler buried in the shade with bags of ice. The first 2 days were exactly what I wanted, peaceful. I fished in the creek, caught nothing worth eating but didn't care. I hiked a few miles up a ridge and sat for hours just staring down into the tree line. At night, I cooked canned beans, sometimes fried a little meat, and sat by the fire until the dark got too heavy. The nights were colder than I expected, and the forest felt so empty it made me uneasy at times, but I convinced myself it was just because I wasn't used to being so far from people. On the third night, things changed. I had been asleep for a couple of hours when I woke up suddenly. At first, I thought it was the wind, but I lay still and realized I was hearing footsteps outside the tent. Not an animal scurrying or a branch falling. These were steady, slow, heavy steps, moving in circles around where I was sleeping. My heart hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. I kept my hand on the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. The steps stopped after a few minutes, and I told myself it must have been a deer or elk. I didn't unzip the tent to check. The next morning, I went outside expecting to see hoof prints or disturbed dirt. What I saw instead was different. There were boot prints, clear as day, pressed into the soil a few feet from my tent. They weren't mine. I checked against the soles of my hiking boots. These prints were larger, heavier, and came from a different tread pattern. They circled the tent twice, then led off into the woods toward the creek. The discovery put me on edge all day. I thought about leaving right then, but I convinced myself it was probably some hunter passing by who got curious about my camp. Still, I felt watched the whole time I was out there. When I walked to the creek, I kept checking behind me. When I went into the trees for firewood, I carried the knife on my belt. That night, I built the fire bigger than usual, hoping the light would keep whatever was out there away. I stayed awake longer, too, sitting in my chair, staring into the darkness, listening to every sound. Around midnight, I heard snapping branches again, not too far away. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone was out there. I sat with my flashlight in one hand and the knife in the other until the fire died low, then crawled into the tent. Sleep didn't last long. Around 3 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of my cooler being dragged across the ground. It was a heavy cooler, loaded with ice and food, and it scraped against the dirt. I froze, barely breathing. The dragging sound went on for half a minute, then stopped. After a long silence, I heard slow footsteps moving away from camp into the woods. When daylight finally came, I stepped outside and my stomach dropped. The cooler was gone, dragged at least 30 yards before the tracks disappeared into the undergrowth. The prints were the same boot prints I had seen before. Whoever it was had taken it during the night. That was enough for me. I decided I would pack up and hike back toward my truck. I started stuffing my gear into bags, constantly glancing over my shoulder. Halfway through rolling up the tent, I noticed something hanging from a tree branch on the edge of camp. It was one of my shirts, the one I had left drying near the fire the day before. Someone had taken it and tied it up there like a flag. I didn't waste more time. I crammed everything into my backpack, not even bothering to fold or organize. I left behind the heavier stuff I couldn't carry quickly. My only goal was to get to the truck. The hike back should have taken me 2 hours, but I walked so fast it felt like running. The whole way, I kept hearing faint noises, sticks breaking, faint crunches of leaves behind me. I never saw anyone, but I never stopped feeling that I wasn't alone. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sight of my truck nearly made me cry with relief. I tossed my pack in the back and climbed inside, locking the doors instantly. The inside of the cab smelled warm and safe compared to the woods. But then I noticed something else. On the hood of the truck, tucked under the windshield wiper, was a piece of paper folded twice. My throat went dry as I reached out the window to grab it. There were only 3 words written in messy, uneven handwriting. "See you soon." That was it. No name, no explanation, nothing else. I drove out of there so fast my tires sprayed gravel everywhere. I didn't stop until I hit a gas station almost an hour away. Sitting there, parked under the bright lights, I finally let myself breathe. I thought about calling the sheriff, but what would I even tell them? stranger walked around my tent, stole my cooler, hung up a shirt, and left me a note. They hadn't hurt me, hadn't technically done anything illegal besides trespassing. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. Someone had been watching me from the moment I arrived. They had walked in circles around my tent while I slept, close enough to touch the fabric. They had dragged my things away in the dark, just to see if I would notice. And they had left that note on my truck to make sure I understood I was never as alone as I thought. I never went back to that forest. In fact, I haven't gone camping alone since. Whenever I think about it now, I realize the scariest part wasn't the footsteps or even the note. It was knowing that someone had been out there in the dark, silent, patient, and always one step away from letting me see their face. That week was supposed to be a break from noise and people, but it ended with the loudest silence I've ever felt, the kind that follows you long after you leave the woods. I was 24 the summer I decided to take a long camping trip through the Midwest. It was July of 2009, hot and sticky during the day, but the nights had a way of cooling down sharp, especially out in the woods. I had an old Ford pickup with a camper shell in the back and all the gear I thought I needed. A tent, a sleeping bag, a little propane stove, a hatchet, and a cooler full of cheap food and beer. I'd planned to stop at different state parks along the way, pitching my tent wherever I could find a quiet spot. By the time I hit southern Missouri, I was several days into the trip, already worn down from the heat and long stretches of driving. I wanted somewhere off the beaten path, away from the families with kids and the RVs stacked shoulder to shoulder. I found a small campground deep in the Mark Twain National Forest. It wasn't one of the more popular sites, just a couple of primitive campsites, no running water, no lights, nothing fancy. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck near the edge of the gravel pull-off and carried my tent a few hundred feet into the trees, far enough that I couldn't see the road. The woods there were thick, the kind that swallowed sound and gave you the sense that you were alone even when you weren't. I set up camp slowly, hammering the stakes into the ground, checking over the lines twice. The air was damp, the ground still soft from rain earlier in the week, and every step I took made a sucking sound in the mud. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going. I ate a can of beans, drank a beer, and watched the shadows lengthen through the trees. It was quiet, too quiet in a way. Even in the middle of the forest, you expect birds or crickets. Something. That evening, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves high above me, like something moving where I couldn't see. As the light drained out of the sky, I noticed how heavy the air had gotten. The fire smoke didn't rise. It just hung low and drifted around me, clinging to my clothes. I stayed up until the wood was nothing but glowing coals, then crawled into my tent. The nylon walls sagged slightly from the moisture, and the smell of wet earth pressed in from all sides. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to a faint crunch outside. At first, I thought it was a branch falling, maybe a raccoon nosing around the campsite. I held still, listening. Another step, then another. Slow, deliberate, not the quick, nervous shuffle of an animal. These were footsteps. My heart started hammering. I told myself it could be another camper, someone who had come late and was just finding a spot. But why would they be this far from the parking area? Why would they be moving so slowly? I reached quietly for the hatchet I kept just inside the tent flap and gripped it tight. The steps circled the tent, crunching lightly in the damp leaves. I didn't breathe. I just stared at the thin fabric wall, waiting to see a shadow fall across it. The footsteps stopped near the back of the tent, then nothing. The silence stretched on until I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. Eventually, I forced myself to lie back down, though I didn't sleep. The next morning, the ground around my camp looked normal at first. But when I walked behind the tent, my stomach dropped. There were prints, boot prints, large ones, pressed deep into the mud. Whoever had been there had stood just a few feet from where my head had been all night. I scanned the woods in every direction, but the prints just disappeared into the undergrowth. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but pride kept me there. I told myself it was probably some hunter or hiker who had wandered too close. Still, the idea of someone creeping around my tent in the middle of the night gnawed at me. That day dragged on slow. I tried fishing at a small creek about half a mile from camp, but I couldn't relax. Every sound behind me made me whip my head around. By the time I hiked back to camp, I was sweaty, tense, and jumpy. As the sun set again, the forest fell into that same dead silence. I ate a little, drank some water, and stoked up the fire bigger than the night before, telling myself the light would keep anything or anyone away. Around midnight, I was lying in my sleeping bag with the hatchet next to me, my ears straining. And then I heard it again. Footsteps, heavier this time, coming from the trees. They stopped at the edge of the campfire glow, just far enough that I couldn't see. I sat up, my whole body shaking, the hatchet in my hand. Whoever it was didn't come closer. They just stood there. I could feel it even though I couldn't see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. After what felt like hours, the footsteps backed away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't staying another day. I packed up fast, shoving gear into the truck bed without caring how neat it was. When I bent down to pull the last stake from the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. On the trunk of a tree, just outside the fire's glow, someone had carved a mark. It wasn't words, just a rough X, freshly cut into the bark, still raw and pale against the dark wood. It hadn't been there when I set up camp. I threw the tent in the truck without folding it, slammed the tailgate, and peeled out down the gravel road, rocks spitting from under the tires. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway with the forest shrinking in the rearview mirror. Even then, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see a vehicle following me. I never went back to that part of Missouri. I finished the trip, but I stuck to crowded campgrounds, places with people and lights and noise. It's been years, but I can still remember the sound of those slow footsteps in the leaves, circling me in the dark, and that carved X in the tree like a warning or a claim. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know they were watching me, and I know I was right to leave.